This is the Team Performance Podcast, where we explore issues at the heart of leadership, team development, and organisational culture. I'm your host, Mark Gilroy, and in a series of interviews, we'll be featuring a number of special guests, discussing some of the latest research into high-performing teams, through to coaching techniques and the freshest thinking in behavioural science. In this episode, we're joined by PCS author and founder Gordon Mackenzie, as he reveals his earliest experiences of leadership at school in Yorkshire, right through to his career in the Royal Marines, leading to various roles in the National Health Service, Hay Management Consultants and ICI, before eventually starting his own consultancy practice. In our discussion, he shares a number of great insights, including the exciting thing about team climate and its links to performance, the biggest mistake he made as a young leader, and examining the common themes that emerging and experienced leaders tend to struggle with. Welcome to the first in our series of interviews, and I'm thrilled to have Gordon Mackenzie, who's the founder of Performance Climate Systems Limited and an author of the PCS tool, joining me today for a dive into his background and a chat about all things leadership, climate and performance. Thank you so much for joining us, Gordon.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
So maybe a good place for us to get started is about your own leadership journey. Can you say a bit more about your career in leadership? What have been some of the highlights for you?
Okay. Actually, we share a common background. I grew up in Yorkshire, not very far away from where you are now. Went to comprehensive school, ordinary middle-class parents, and loved sport and hated school. So as soon as I could get away from school and my parents, I went off and joined the military, joined the Royal Marines, and I was very lucky to achieve a commission in the Royal Marines, where I served for 8 years. And I think that was my formative experience of leadership and leadership development, high performance teams, and flexibility, adaptability, I suppose. Because certainly in the forces, you are in different environments the whole year round, meeting different people. You know, one minute you're mixing with royalty and politicians, and the next you're sharing a trench with somebody that has come from a very humble background. So that was, I think, my formative years. I left in 1992 after 8 years. I got injured, so some of the things I wanted to do, I couldn't. And I was lucky enough to join the National Health Service as my first job out of the services, with carte blanche to really set up and run a management development business for the NHS, which was allowed to make excess income rather than profit. And at that time, they also paid for me, sponsored me to do an MBA at Warwick. And again, that was fantastic in terms of giving me that strategic business understanding that I suppose I felt that I was missing at the time. And from there, I went on to join Hay Management Consultants, part of the Hay Group, which was a couple of years of excellent, hard-nosed organizational change and business consulting. And whilst I loved it, and I came across some of the original research around PCS, or that sits behind PCS, it wasn't for me. And I missed the building teams and staying with them. So I went back into corporate life, and I worked in financial services for a little bit, and then joined ICI, and I was head of training for Europe for ICI, which was a fantastic role, but again made me realize that this wasn't my journey. And in fact, my father died whilst I was at ICI, and I had this blinding realization. Some people call it a midlife crisis, I think, where I realized I was following his journey through life, not my own. And it was at that point that I sat down with a good colleague of mine from a previous role, and we decided to set up Performance First, which was our consultancy, and I ran that for 20 years. And that itself was an amazing journey, working with high-performing teams, Formula One teams, World Rally teams, big and small organizations from every field. And what was great was the variety, and the travel, but actually people, irrespective of what organization you're in, people are the same. So the leadership challenges building high performing teams, it's the same challenge. And I was very lucky to be able to see a lot of patterns and to develop PCS during that time so that we could then establish it as a standalone brand. And I sold my consultancy to my then business partner in 2019, just before COVID. Sheer luck rather than judgment. And we set up PCS as a standalone business back then. And you are now taking it to fruition, which is wonderful.
Yeah, this is a slightly different interview from some of the others in our series, which are looking at sort of practitioners of PCS and some people who are, real exemplars of some of the areas. So this is a bit of a different one in terms of our dynamics and our meeting. I think what's really interesting to me is about when people have been on these amazing kind of career journeys like you have, how all of those different elements have kind of shaped them and shaped their understanding of the world and shaped the way that they look at leadership. And in your case, in the origins of a tool like PCS, a lot of people will be listening to this, maybe um, active practitioners of this tool. Some people might be listening and they've never heard of PCS. So I think it might be worth just touching on that, your evolution from Hay into ICI and thinking through the early origin story of the PCS tool. Can you just share a bit more about what happened there? What was that like?
Yeah, I suppose I'd always thought of sort of leadership in my early career as sort of some sort of dark art that you either had it or you didn't. And that people were natural leaders, and I rapidly changed that view, and I now think I absolutely believe that leadership is a process. Anybody can do it, and what I tried to do with PCS is to describe that journey. And a lot of it is based on my experience of working with high performance teams, working with great leaders across the world. And the other part of it, a big part of it, is based on research. And going back to that original research by McClellan, Boyatzis, Spencer, it was not around leadership. It was not around anything other than this thing called climate. And the original research I came across was fundamentally said that the biggest single factor that impacts the performance of a team or an organization is climate, the way it feels around here. Different from culture, which is more mood. Culture is much more hardwired, and hence most culture change programs that we've all been on haven't succeeded. It's hardwired in the founders, and it's very difficult for them to give up that legacy, which has been successful to get them to where they are. Climate is much more like the weather outside. It's changeable. And when I was in the force, in fact, there's a picture behind me on the wall of HMS London. I spent a while during the first Gulf War as an intelligence officer, going around each of the warships in the British fleet, and I found it fascinating that I could land on a warship and within 2 minutes know if it was a happy ship or not, whether it was a performing ship or not. You just felt it in the air. And that was in the back of my mind. So when I came across McClellan's theories, and it said that the biggest single factor that impacts performance is climate, and the biggest single factor that impacts climate is leadership, it connected all the dots for me. And I suppose my career has always been I'm pretty good at connecting dots. I love different theories if I can see that they work. Throughout my MBA, I was probably a bit of a nightmare because I challenged the lecturers and the professors all the time, because I go, no, that's bollocks, that doesn't work in real life, or actually, I quite like that, and I can see how that links with something else. And so for me, that was joining the dots. And the fundamental basis of PCS is if you can measure climate, you're getting a surrogate measure of performance, and you're getting an effective measure of the impact of the leader. Now, if you think about organizations, every department, every function has a different output. So in finance, it's making sure that you've got your management accounts in on time and that everything balances. In HR, it's about staff turnover, etc. In sales, it's about profit and the sales volume. So everybody's got different metrics. But actually, if you use climate as a metric, then you've got an ability to measure every single function, every single team, irrespective of level, size, shape, which for me was the sort of the holy grail. That was the thing I thought, absolutely, that's what leaders need. Because I haven't met a CEO today or a CFO who isn't focused on performance. They talk a lovely game about, we value our people are the most important thing, which might be true, but fundamentally, the stakeholders, the shareholders, measure them on performance. So for me, this was the great thing about PCS. It gave us as consultants and it gave our clients the ability to benchmark the whole organization. And taking that one step further, it also allowed them to benchmark every single leader. And quite often, toxic leaders in an organization were quite well hidden. And great leaders were even more hidden because they make their bosses look good, so they never got promoted. So this was a way of identifying where you had pockets of greatness, of really good, solid leadership, and also a way of identifying where you had a bad egg, so to speak, who was seriously impacting performance.
It's interesting, isn't it? We I think within the realms of leadership, we very often end up talking about necessarily the positive and really appreciative side of what good leadership looks like and what success looks like and what exemplars of leadership look like. But quite rarely do we put that stuff on the table about what toxic leadership can look like. And interesting what you say there about sometimes they can be hidden. What do you think it is about organisations that can sometimes hide and mask that aspect of leadership?
Well, again, this goes back to Hay, and we did a lot of work when I was in Hay in running assessment centres, big global assessment centres. And what we found was that the most accurate results compared with an independent external assessment centre with as objective measures of success as possible was the view of the team. It's not the boss's view of an individual. It's not a peer's view, which is often skewed because you're in competition for the next job, perhaps. It was the direct reports. So, in the 80s, 90s, there was lots and lots of 360 feedback. Actually, 180 feedback is the important bit. It's what your people see of you. And the reason that was so accurate was because they see you every day. Whereas a boss might see you once a week in a meeting or irregularly over a teleconference like this, particularly as things like COVID have made working from home more obvious. And it's easier to put on a front. So you often found that people who got promoted were the ones who were really good at, I won't say sucking up to the boss, but had a good relationship with their line manager rather than being judged on the impact they were having on their team. And again, it comes back to the climate piece. Leaders create that climate that motivates and delivers performance. And if you take the research further, 70% of our motivation is intrinsic. It's within us. You and I get up every day on time to do a good job because that's the way we were brought up by our parents. That's what we set as expectations of ourselves. That's our standards. Now, my 70% and your 70% might be different, but realistically, it's around the same. The other 30% is extrinsic. It's discretionary. I can choose to turn it on. And when I've had great bosses, they've extracted some more out of me, and I've gone that extra mile. And on occasion, I've delivered 100%, for 48, 72 hours without a break because of their leadership and the motivation that they've given me, and the task is important. When you come to toxic leaders, they don't get that discretionary effort. They don't get that extra 30% out of you or I. But sometimes they also impact my intrinsic leadership. So as a consultant, going into organizations, the first question I typically ask is, where's the highest level of staff turnover? Where's the highest level of sickness and absence? Because 9 times out of 10, that's where you would find a leadership issue.
And are those the sort of things you were talking about with the ships that you were on earlier on? You were talking about, how you could just walk onto a ship and you could feel it. If we're drilling down into kind of what was actually going on in those teams, is it similar kinds of things?
And actually, when I went to war during Op Granby or Desert Storm, I left an organisation that was pretty toxic. The leader was not well liked, and part of the reason I left the forces actually is that was not a
Mm.
model of leadership that I was happy to and comfortable to follow. I went away, and the leadership of that organisation changed whilst I was away, and I came back. And I remember walking through the gates of the camp, and people were smiling and they were, "Wow, welcome back, sir," throwing up a salute. And I was thinking, what's going on? Something significantly different. This is not the place I remember. And the only thing that changed was the commanding officer, who
Right.
was a completely different character. And instantly, literally within 2 minutes of walking down the main street of the camp, I could tell something significant had changed. And that, for me, is the exciting thing about climate. It just
Mm.
is pervasive. I mean, you see it in organizations. Ask yourself, a great question I ask people is, when you go for a job interview, how long is it before you decide whether this is an organization you want to work for or not? Because you just get that feel, that somehow, I say gut feel, or that sixth sense as you walk into an organization. And when people are really cynical about PCS, I say, okay, just go back to school. Think about your performance in your best subject versus
Mm.
your worst subject. How much of that was down to your innate intelligence, and how much of it was down to the relationship with the teacher?
Mm.
And every
Yeah.
time I've asked that question of a group, they all go the teacher, because there were some teachers at school who made us feel like we walked on water and really motivated us. I can see you looking at the ceiling there, Mark. You're actually
Yeah.
revisiting it.
It's a really good way of bringing people to
Yeah,
that sense of what does it look like, what does it
yeah,
feel like? Because it is. I remember those teachers vividly like it was yesterday, and they made lessons unmissable,
yes. And
absolutely
then
unmissable.
the opposite end, he's probably dead now. So Mr. Hudson was my maths teacher. I loved maths until I got Mr. Hudson. My favourite teacher was Mrs. Corchet, and she made maths fun. And I
Yeah.
wasn't that brilliant at it, but actually she motivated me to do the work. And then for A
Mm.
levels, I had Mr. Hudson, and I never went to a lesson after the first 6 months. Needless to say, I failed my maths, and I ended up in an HR career rather than finance. Look for.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I think, out of all the practitioners of PCS, as the founder and the author, you were using this before, way before it became a product and a tool that you could buy. You were experimenting with the concepts and the theory and the framework. Have there been any kind of golden threads running through them around needs and demands and areas that typically a lot of leaders tend to really struggle with? That's something like PCS can really help with.
Yeah. The way PCS is designed is, and it is something that's been iterative over, as you say, probably 15, 16 years. And now you're taking it, to the next level with AI and stuff, which is very exciting. But fundamentally, if you look at performance of an organization or a team, there's some really good research by Stringer, etc., around what delivers great performance. If you look at all the research into climate, again, you've got similar factors. So when you put the two together, you're actually, and when you look at leadership as well and what makes really effective leaders, you're actually talking about the same thing. So
Mm.
the way we've designed PCS is like a clock face, and it's a roadmap for leadership. It's a roadmap for building a high performance team, and it's a roadmap to create an effective performance culture. And it goes back to what I said. Leadership isn't some dark art; it is a process. And I love the fact when you're working with people who've come up through a technical background, whether it's engineering, IT, or finance, and they see themselves in this lane as accountants first or engineers first, and they've sort of got a blind spot when it comes to leadership. And you actually then say to them, look, guys, leadership is a process. Building high performance teams is a process. Start at 12 o'clock, work around. And when you get back to 12 o'clock, go back round again, because something will have changed in the environment and you need to adapt and you need to revisit these things. Start with goals. what's the mission, the vision? In Simon Sinek's terms, what's the why? Why are we here? What's the purpose? Because when I join a team, the first thing I want to know is this a team I want to be part of? Is the mission something that I value? Yeah. And as a leader, if you can establish that, then tick one box. The next thing I need to know is what am I here to do? So I know the game we're playing, and I like that game. Let's say it's rugby or football or netball, whatever it happens to be. Next thing I want to know is where's my position? How can I personally add value? So what number shirt am I wearing? What is my position? What are my responsibilities? And what are the other members of the team? And are we structured in the right way in order to deliver the mission, the vision, the objectives, the goals? So it starts off with the why, the what, and then the who, and then the next one is how, the processes. What are the plays? What are the ways of working which will enable us to succeed? Get those three things right, which takes you from 12, I should do it the other way, 12 through to 6, then you will deliver high performance. The challenge then, and anybody can do that. You can do that as a toxic leader by being highly directive, or you can do it as an effective coach by asking all the right questions. So what PCS doesn't do is tell you how to lead. What it does is give you a roadmap of what you need to achieve. Once you get to 6 o'clock and you got to the processes, everything's likely to change. So the wonderful example, I say wonderful, the best example I can give is we're all working happily and then COVID arrives and suddenly we've got to work from home. So adaptability in order to sustain performance over time is really, really critical. And so that's the next factor. And the adaptability piece isn't change for change's sake. It's around, okay, what do we need to adapt in order to ensure that we continue to succeed? Do our goals change because of COVID? Possibly. We might not be able to deliver some of our products. So a lot of our colleagues in the training and development world suddenly found that their order book fell through the floor overnight. Has my role changed? Well, yes, absolutely. I'm selling over a media rather than face to face. I'm having to deliver training over, some platform rather than face to face. Have the processes and procedures all changed? Yes, absolutely, because all our people are working from home. So how do we adapt to make sure that they can deliver optimally? So massive, massive differences straight away. And you've got to go back to the drawing board around goals, roles, and processes. The next piece is around connection, which is probably the biggest mistake I made as a young leader, as a young second lieutenant, wanting to build relationships within the team, which is no bad thing. Relationships are really important. That connection, that glue that keeps the team together is really, really important. But note, I said it keeps the team together. It doesn't establish the team in the first place. And as a leader, you need to establish credibility in terms of the goals, roles, and processes bit. And in the military, when the stakes are very high, if you haven't established that credibility, then you're probably the first casualty of war, because they might like you, but are they going to follow you into battle?
That's the weird thing about credibility, isn't it? I remember picking this up from a good friend of mine, Phil Wilcox, who runs a consultancy called Emotion at Work. He talked about credibility in the sense that whilst it is something that you can carry, it's something you never really own, because it's given to you by other people based on your actions and your behaviours and whether or not you see things through. It can be taken away like that by everyone else around you, and then you have no control over it. Whereas there are things that you can actively do to help build it, but it's never something you can really fully own yourself. It's bestowed by others.
And the important thing is it takes time to build. So you can't have credibility, you can't have the trust of your team the moment you walk through the door as a new leader or a new manager of that team. It takes time to build, and it only takes a second for it to be gone. Tony Blair would be a great example. Actually, pretty effective. Forget the politics. Pretty effective as a prime minister until he lied, and then that's his legacy. Everybody remembers him as Tony Blair rather than Tony Blair, and that's the same for any leader at any level in an organisation. If you fail in that connection piece, you're dead in the water.
You alluded to this earlier on when you were so that second lieutenant role, was that your first proper leadership role, would you say?
Absolutely. 28 Falkland veterans. I joined just after the Falklands War, so there was I straight out of the box with no experience, just a year's worth of leadership training, and it was a tough gig because I had to earn their respect, and I probably was very. I wish I could go back now and do what I did then with the knowledge I have. I was okay. But I was never the best leader. And of course, the great thing about the forces is you change jobs every year to 2 years. So you get a new opportunity and a new group of people to, hate to say it, experiment with and learn the lessons of the past. So quite rapidly, you're building a level of competence very quickly with different people in different jobs, which is hugely valuable and very rare, I think, in a lot of organizations, because I still see people who are in their mid 30s and getting their first team leadership role, and it's like, wow, I was so fast tracked at 19, 20 to be able to have 30 people reporting to me and trying to manage that. So yeah, I've been hugely lucky in my career, I think, to get that level of experience, which allowed me to do what I've done.
And what again, you touched on this just a second ago. If we had a little time machine on the call,
Mm-hmm.
and you were able to go back and have a little conversation with your 20-something-year-old self in your first leadership role, with all the knowledge that you have now, what piece or pieces of advice might you offer that version of you?
Well, it's interesting. I would love to go back um, and revisit Royal Marines officer training, Army officer training, Navy, Air Force training, and be able to share some of the stuff I know now with the young officers going through their officer selection, their officer training, because none of this is rocket science, and a lot of the leadership training in the military is still based on stuff from Adair and all good stuff, but 50, 100 years ago, and it's good, but it's more around character and output rather than input. And actually, I think what I've learned is if you can follow a simple roadmap, you won't go too far wrong. You won't go wrong. Literally, you won't go wrong. You'll get it right. Now, you might not do it in the most stylish way, but you will get the results. And I've seen that with people who, as I was saying before, engineers who suddenly get this different way of seeing things. They see themselves suddenly as, okay, so I can do leadership. And you see their PCS results go from, in the mid 50s, suddenly into up into the 80s. And the performance of their organization is transformed in really short periods of time. So yeah, I'd love to be able to go back to, when I was 20 as a young troop commander and do it differently. Having said that, we can't go back, and not doing it differently probably formed my character and gave me some of the information I need today. And what's good is, PCS is now being used by the Marines, it's being used by the Army, and it's highlighting some real challenges for them because they have retention problems, they have, issues that PCS highlights, and sometimes that's a tough mirror to hold up to those organisations, as it is for any organisation when it shows that you're not potentially getting it as right as you could.
Yeah, and that's for me one of the things that drew me to the tool. I don't have that background, that military background that you have, Gordon, but I do have a background in coaching and particularly in more recent years, sort of interested in kind of systems thinking and systems coaching. And one of the beauties of PCS is that it is just a mirror. You can hold it up to a team and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about the way that you look? Is there anything you want to change? And the nice thing about that from a consulting or a coaching perspective is that none of that's coming from you. You're just purely the person or people who act as the vehicle towards them having those realizations about, okay, this is what needs changing. Here's the roadmap. I don't like the look of the way we're heading as a group. Let us figure out a new way to move forward together. And then all of the ownership is on the leader and the team in order to make that change that's going to make a really positive difference for them. And I think that's one of the real beauties of a tool like this, that you can you can have it as a powerful, data-driven, evidence-based mirror that will allow a team to make a really constructive change for the better.
You've said two things there that I think are really important. Data driven, so it's research based, it's data driven, but you talk about the team rather than the leader. A lot of engagement surveys and a lot of leadership 360s put the pressure on the leader and say, you've got to behave in a certain way based on these behaviors or these characteristics. So they're input models. And PCS is actually quite clever because the way Section 3 works is around asking open coaching questions. And that is really focused on the team. So what it also does is take some of the pressure off the leader and actually gets the team to work on the solutions rather than the leader seeing it as their own challenge and something they've got to do alone. It involves the team. And actually, when you look at any high-performing team, there isn't one leader. It's the leadership rotates. A high-performing sports team, by the time the team get into the changing room at half-time or at full-time, any of the bollockings that have got to be given have already been given on the pitch before the coach actually has to open their mouth. And that's high-performing teams. People take ownership and responsibility for the performance of and the result. And PCS encourages that, which I think is good. And you mentioned coaching. It's so rewarding when you just share the data with the team and you say, guys, what do you see? And it inevitably gets into a big debate. And people are very honest about where they've scored low, where they've scored high, what they think is working well, what they think is not working so well, even down to the leadership. And what you find is that leaders tend to come out of it more positive, more supportive than when they go in. And certainly the first time people do PCS, there is always a little bit of, what are we going to see here? By the time teams have done it 2 or 3 times, even when you get to the anonymous comments, most of the time people write their names next to it because they are, they've moved up the Lencioni curve. They are taking accountability. They are taking responsibility. And they go, I've scored this low because we still haven't got it right yet and we need to adjust them. And that for me is really rewarding. And when they start to use the language of the PCS in their day-to-day conversations, it's landed.
As we start to wrap up, I'd like to say another huge thank you to you, Gordon, for everything you've shared here in our conversation today. It's been such an insightful discussion, and I'm sure there's loads of really important learning and takeaways for our listeners. Now, if people wanted to continue this conversation with you, where can people find out more about you?
Through PCS. So I'm, although I've handed the baton on, Mark, and I'm so pleased to do it because what I love is actually delivering rather than running a business. Just contact me through you. I'm still doing quite a bit of work with PCS, still doing a lot of support to people who are coming through the practitioner routes and for new partners, just again, giving them those insights and background and supporting you on the journey. So feel free to contact me via PCS.
Yeah, glad to hear it. And genuinely, a lot of people who I've been in touch with over the last year or so since I joined the business have mentioned you by name on several occasions, particularly having been the kind of end recipient of your coaching and mentoring over the years. So it's good that you haven't quite put down that baton entirely yet.
I don't think I ever will. I love it. I'm at the stage where I want to do other things in my life. So I've got a small holding in Hungary now, but in between, I still love working with teams and seeing them move from one place to another. And that's still very exciting. So I don't think I'll hang up the hat just yet.
Thanks again, Gordon, and we'll see you next time, folks.
Thank you. Good to talk, Mark.
If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by subscribing and leaving a review on your favourite podcast app. Meanwhile, if you're interested to learn more about how the PCS approach can help you explore leadership, performance, and culture within your business, get in touch with our team at performanceclimatesystem.com and we'll be happy to help. See you next time with another great guest.